who's the left-wing version of Joe Rogan? Joe Rogan was. You kicked him out. Who's the left-wing version of Elon Musk? Elon Musk was. You kicked him out. Same with RFK. Same with Tulsi Gabbard. These people were all in the Cool Kids Club. She was the vice chair of the Democratic Party. And then they kicked him out.
I'm Dr. Randy Bock, and I'm honored today to have Andrew Follett with me. I saw initially through John Stossel's video. Perhaps you can describe a little bit his role there. It was a couple of years ago, but still pertinent. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on. Tell us a little about yourself and maybe that episode.
Well, it's great to be here. So that particular episode was based on a piece I wrote about how a lot of science, and an increasing amount of it, is deeply fraudulent at a lot of levels. And Americans don't trust science the way they used to. And that's because science is increasingly untrustworthy.
Yeah. So what was the example you used there?
Well, I used a bunch, but the most notable one was you had the National Science Foundation, or the NSF, was giving massive amounts of money in absolute terms to study feminist glaciology, or glacier, which is ridiculous. So my academic training, I'm a geologist, which is unrelated to what you do, and I have seen so much science get utterly tortured just to align with a narrative. And it's really sad because that fundamentally biases the canon of knowledge for mankind. It's really bad. And for the most part, it's being done to advance very narrow partisan, ideological, and in many cases, financial interest.
I agree there. We're not necessarily all that far off. I don't treat rocks. But my background was in chemistry and physics, and there's a little bit of chemistry going on in rocks. Pretty slow, though.
Oh, yes. Not a geologist a million years ago that's recent.
Yeah, I agree. The one thing, just a total sidelight, interesting thing I saw recently, and I went through, college, and I tried to read and keep awake and whatnot, that coal was formed because of a kind of an anomaly in time, the absence of fungi or bacteria that could break down animal byproducts, so forth. Mm-hmm. Can you maybe just tell us what that means? And what does that mean, the fact that nobody's ever heard of that before?
Well, so a lot of stuff like this. There's a lot of public misconceptions about how this stuff works. People will often joke, when you burn oil, you're burning a dead dinosaur. It's not. It's from a completely different time period. Most coal is from an era called the Carboniferous, mm-hmm. which is, I forget the exact dating on it, but it's not the dinosaurs. So entirely different time period. But what's interesting about this is that, like, as I was saying earlier, Americans don't trust authority anymore. That's largely to do with COVID. That's largely to do with a lot of things. And what's kind of funny is until 2018, which was not that long ago, most Americans had a great deal of confidence in the scientific community. And now, if you sort it out politically, Democrats are about 40 points more likely to have that great deal of confidence than Republicans and independents, by the way. So confidence in science has dropped off a cliff, and it's done it in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's funny you use that phrase, drop off a cliff. I actually used exactly that phrase because there's going to be a demonstration or there somewhere on the mall, the Washington Mall, to follow the science. And I don't know who's sponsoring that, whether it's Pfizer or Dr. Fauci's trust fund. I have no idea. But, the funny thing is, I said they're going to follow the science off a cliff. And yes. It made me think of Lemmings. And when I was graduating high school, whatever, there was a show called Lemmings. and that was the original, like right before Saturday Night Live. John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd and whatnot. They were in the show I saw off Broadway called Lemmings, and Lemmings have always gotten a bad name as kind of this mass self-suicidal group that, you know, they're a bunch of little rodent type things, and they ran off a cliff and whatever, they killed themselves because they're all following each other. And so you don't want to follow the science, you don't want to follow too closely and be able to fall off like what was that movie with Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis? Anyway,
well, so lemmings don't actually do that.
I know. So that's kind of the funny thing. I thought it was like ironic that I came up with that as an, you know, analogy, like, you know, follow the science off a cliff, you know, follow it blindly, because lemmings are smarter than that. But I'm not sure that necessarily everybody who's just kind of like quote unquote following the science is. And so, yeah, they were put up by Disney in 1950 something, where, you know, 1959 or something like that. You know, this was all staged, and they made it Lemmings. I mean, Lemmings never sued them. This is probably they didn't have a good lawyers or whatever, but the Lemmings should have sued them, because, you know, they don't do that. You know, there's no real, you know, group of animals that's self-suicidal like that, possibly except for, you know, groups of you know, I'll leave politics aside, but certain groups of people seem to be self-suicidal, either, you know, out of guilt or sometimes out of, you know, there's other kind of self-suicides like kamikaze and IEDs and whatnot, terrorists and whatnot. But, you know, there is kind of a weird aspect that, you know, perhaps not, you know, lemmings are out of the running here, but humans might be the only ones suicidal. How much of what we're kind of construing or misconstruing of society, of science, is societally suicidal?
A huge percentage. But what's fascinating to me is that you can, so I mean, all science inherently is supposed to revolve around control groups, right? You're supposed to understand the distinction between what you're testing. And that's a very fundamental thing. So there actually turns out to be a control group science, right? That we've already created. It's called parapsychology. That's entirely fake. This is Ghostbusters stuff, right?
Yeah.
Look, I don't believe in parapsychology. But what's fascinating is people who do believe in parapsychology, the evidence of scientific norms are so flimsy that parapsychologists are able to produce experimental evidence for literal psychic abilities just as easily as, you know, actual conventional scientists. So researchers who believe in psychic powers, literally psychic powers, they find statistically significant evidence for them. But people who don't believe in it, they don't. Right? So what we're actually signaling here, the signal you're picking up is just the researcher's bias. And they don't even necessarily know. But people are very capable of subtly cheating a little bit and getting the result they want to get.
Interesting point. You know, I was watching one of those little Instagram reels that are prevalent. It wasn't on Instagram, it was on X. And it's got my my eponymous James Randi. It was called The Amazing Randi back in the day. But that was his last name. Mine's first. And I'm not named for him. But James Randi, The Amazing Randi, debunked parapsychology. And so he would go on stage with Bob Barker and whatnot on a show, and you know, and try to like show that the guy was actually blowing the pages across rather than, you know, mentally, you know, Uri Gellering the bent spoon and whatnot. So yeah, it's very important to have control groups. I find that a lot of the, you know, so-called science that we're supposed to follow doesn't have that. You know, people call climate science that, you know, I call it climate predictive data modeling, which is not as catchy on the lips. But a lot of things, unless you can actually run experiments, don't, you know, you can watch something. You know, I think that, you know, I follow sports a reasonable amount, and, you know, I'm not sure who's going to win the NBA finals this year. I have some thoughts because there's probably 8 or, you know, 9 top teams, whatever, probably one of them. But 7 years from now, 12 years from now, you know, 50 years from now, can you know, tell me the Super Bowl champion, like even 10 years from now, which shouldn't be that hard. But you know all the teams. You actually know more about the teams and the upcoming players and people in high school and whatnot, coaches, and be able to make a better prediction based on owners and, you know, past whatever, who's going to win the Super Bowl 10 years now. And you could possibly do for something, I think, as unpredictable as certain weather patterns. I might be wrong about that, but you tell me.
Yeah, well, so they would say that it's easier to predict extremely long-term things, like the stock market will probably go up in like the next 10 years, but it might go down or up at any given day.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not, so what I'm fascinated by is the solution they are proposing, right? So the solution they are proposing, it's not to build more nuclear reactors. It's not to like, give Elon Musk a bunch of money. It's to literally control the actions of every human being on Earth forever, which is a lot like all the other solutions they propose.
Yeah.
And look, controlling human beings is the hardest thing you can possibly do. It's more difficult than herding cats. I have young kids. I can barely control them, right? And I outweigh them by a huge factor. But controlling humans to get them to like breathe less, I mean, heck, I'm breathing out carbon dioxide. I breathe out, I think it's a kilogram a day. It's a lot. It adds up when there's 8 billion people, right? Yeah. So instead of, just solving this alleged problem, we're going to like regulate breathing. That seems like it's a pretty extreme and not
regulating breathing. Has anyone proposed that?
So yes and no. Carbon taxes would actually be applied to that. So you and I both breathe out a kilogram of CO2 each day, right? So, it's 365 a year times, I think it's 8.2 billion humans now. That's a lot. I think it's about like, I have to check the numbers, but it's a significant amount. It's more than like cows. And that adds up. So instead of like, but it's this obsession with control and having to just absolutely dominate every single aspect of every human being on the planet's life so that you can feel better about yourself. It's this obsession of like treating humans as cells in an Excel spreadsheet to be manipulated and, adjusted a tiny little bit to get the ideal outcome that you want. And so go ahead.
Yeah, I got a question for you. So I saw at some point a total of the biomass of the world. Let's say a certain fraction of it's humans, right? If there were 0 humans in a time when there were fewer humans, let's say you go back, I don't know, 500 years or 1,000, whatever, 10,000, whatever, some minuscule amount of geologic time back, you'd find fewer humans, let's say 1% of what we have now. Was the biomass of living, breathing stuff, maybe more bisons, fewer humans, more, I don't know, squirrels, more, you fill in the blank, wolves, did we just kind of like, there are more of us and fewer wild animals. Is the general biomass of living, breathing things staying different from what it was, say, before we came into existence?
Oh, absolutely. But I don't think it's that different. So again, most of the emissions that we are here, I think humans are some tiny fraction, like less than 1% of biomass on Earth. Most of it's probably ants and beetles and grass.
Right.
But our animals are big. Yeah. What?
Tax the beetles.
Tax the beetles. Yes, tax the beetles. And what's crazy is like a lot of these, it's this inherently naturalistic fallacy, which is often ridiculous. So here's a really good example. There's this a Native American Indian, whatever, tribe up in Canada. I think it's the Haida, right? And they were trying to, and in Canada, their legal system is really weird, and the First Nations tribes can kind of do whatever they want. So they started doing iron fertilizing of offshore animals, just like pumping iron in there so that the salmon had more to eat. So this was literally American Indians, returning to their traditional way of life, making money, doing all these great things that you think left-wing people would be very interested in. And they hated it because it was messing with the natural world, right? And when I was in undergrad, I got yelled at, like literally yelled at by a professor for just talking about this experiment, because that's evil geoengineering and, you're messing with the natural order. And I'm like, this is supposed to be a nominally neutral institution. So it's very cultish in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And you know that when you went against the establishment, they don't like you very much.
No, it's a funny thing, isn't it? I think a lot of it's just kind of team sports.
Yeah.
My brothers and I, we all grew up in New York City, and we were Yankees fans. I've lived more of my life outside of New York than in it. But my brothers are, they've moved out also, but they're, staunch Yankee fans. And, I've had, by one of my brothers in particular, I've had names hurled at me for not, for having my kids follow the local team. They went to the game where, they follow the Red Sox, they take friends, whatever. That's the thing they do. They go out, whatever. That's the stuff they did. I don't think they care as much now. But, it's like I was somehow sullying the memory of our father, blah, 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 terrible. And I think so much of this stuff is just team sports. And mixed in with the fact that more than just fans, you're actually getting paid. And so,
Yes.
I think there's an element of that. No chemistry, pun intended. But when was it ever good? How could it be? Is there like a golden age of scientific inquiry? How do we harken back? Where do we go forward?
Okay, so I would say the golden age was about 1870, which is when you see a lot of the most rapid scientific advancement, right? Just absolutely incredibly rapid. And that was because everyone had to convince you. And people were sending letters and doing all these things, but people had to convince you that their idea was valid, as opposed to like just bullying you because they were so physically distant that you couldn't like intimidate someone in another university. That's insane. Like that's, it take 3 months to get there. But today, so to go back to the Biden administration, the White House official who was overseeing Biden's scientific integrity task force was literally editing the papers of her brother-in-law. And then she was citing that paper before Congress to justify new regulations.
Wow.
Like, that's insanity. Every single person watching this understands why that's corruption, But because of the team sports thing that you were talking about, half the country would offend it because she has the right beliefs to half the country. And that's what's actually happening here is the reaction has been very tribal and very partisan, primarily because people's actual lives were messed with, largely during COVID, but increasingly in other ways.
Now, the COVID experiment on us was an interesting one. I'm trying to parse it out with an old but new connection. We went to high school together. And since you're a geologist, this was back in the
Precambrian.
Yeah, Paleozoic era, something like that. But we've recently reconnoitered because of reunions and stuff like that. And he's on the other team, as it were. But he's a math professor, so he likes numbers. And he's like, well, this was a big bad thing. Kind of we deserved all the medicine we had to take. Nobody likes taking the bad medicine, but this was all warranted. I'm like, no, it wasn't a big bad thing. We had enough data there, and I'm not going to play data with you per se on this. But I quote the Diamond Princess. I don't think people weren't dying by this time. Frankly, this time 5 years ago when the big kind of nodal decision was made, Trump was kind of like seeing it as a bad flu. We didn't have a prior flu shot, so it was going to be worse than the regular flu because of that probably. But carry on. And then he was convinced like 5 years ago, and I write for brownstone.org, and Jeffrey Tucker, the editor, he had his timeline, which I've incorporated in some of my articles, that something happened right about now, right around the Ides of March, wherein Donald Trump was convinced maybe that this was a bioweapon, and they had to like batten the hatches down and treat this like a war thing. And I think, they prepped and prompted and prodded him and perverted him in a sense by giving him data that would be, indicative in one direction, not another. So I think, ultimately science is kind of a debate. You have to see all parts of it. And I think it's very difficult and deceptive when some of the players have interest. So I'm just wondering what your kind of bird's eye view of that, era was, and how would you go about convincing my, say, math professor friend, one way or the other, whether these things were warranted? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I should preface this by saying I know very little about biology, and I'm certainly not a medical doctor. So this is not medical advice. But look, I was aware that there was going to be a problem in January 2020. I actually had mask at the time because I'm a paranoid person. And then by about, I'd say April, I was aware that this was not as bad as I thought it was going to be. And my entire logic at the time in January 2020 was the Chinese like money. They wouldn't shut down unless this was really bad. Right? That was my logic. And I think that's potentially a valid logic in January 2020. Right? And people lost their minds over this. Again, I don't know I'm not an epidemiologist on any of those things. But what was fascinating to me about it is how incredibly crazy everyone went and how precisely it got very slow rolled. And, the famous, 2 weeks to stop the surge became 2 years. And that was it was very disturbing to see just how quickly you can change someone's mind by portraying the data slightly differently. And what was the opportunity cost is what was absolutely bonkers to me, right? What we lost doing that. I mean, schools have still not recovered. You could argue that really only the stock market recovered, and the economy is definitely not in a pre-COVID shape. So the opportunity cost of doing this, was that even close to worth it? I think it's, the transportation department has a statistical value of a life around $10 million or something like that. And how many people, had deaths of despair, had suicides, had, substance abuse issues because we pushed this. And we're not even investigating the origin, really? That seems pretty dubious to me. And again, I know I'm not an epidemiologist.
I agree. I actually think part of that equation or calculus is missing because let's say your life is valued at $10 million, whatever.
That's what the DOT says.
I got it. Fine. So, if you knock somebody off on the highway, whatever, maybe you have to pay out, whatever, some amount like that. Let's say you were worth it. Let's say you're a Kansas City wide receiver and you're making $10 million a year and you do drugs and knock somebody, whatever, malicious death. You probably get sued for that. Fine. So it's $10 million. But I think that what's missing is kind of cutting the cake the different way. So if you look at life as, you're a baby a fair amount of time, and then you're a child, you don't really have that much agency. But let's say your agency years from 16 to, 70 or whatever, 16 to 65 or something like that. Those are when you can do stuff, and that's when you have value societally. Well, we just took we kind of did that Jenga karate chop, we just kind of took a swath out of people's lives of a couple of years. So let's say we have, billions of people on Earth, 200 million people in that age group in the United States, and we just took 2 years of that. So let's say that's 2 years out of the, 5 decades of usefulness, as it were. That's still 4% of life. We're all 200 million. Where I think that's a significant number aside from the death. The fact that we just kind of we froze, everyone's life. No dating, no mating, no greeting, no meeting, no eating, no anything else that Dr. Seuss rhymes together. Told people to sit down and shut up and buy their time and watch Netflix or something like that. I think that's a huge stain, and I think that's playing out in we have this kind of diminishing growth rate or replenishment rate, or I guess they're going to have to change the term, a decline rate. It's just kind of cratering. Japan's disappearing. Not under the ocean, not under tsunami, not because of volcanoes, not because of nuclear war, not because of China, because they're just tired of being around. They can't mate. They can't consort. They can't. Everyone worries about alcohol, but frankly, a lot of people wouldn't be here. For people getting drunk and mating and meeting and dating and whatever, procreating and all that kind of stuff. And it's all that was taken away. All the fun was taken away. It was all blanched out and bleached out by the Faucis of the world. And it's they've already eaten their cake and had their cake, and they're not letting anyone else have their piece.
And those people who made the decision were the ones who were by far at the most risk of COVID, actually dying.
Yeah.
And that's just amazing to me because so I'm a Virginian, right? I live in Virginia. And our state teachers union demanded the vaccine first, right? And then once they got the vaccine, they still refused to go back and teach schools.
Yeah.
And there was so much of this kind of thing. And the only real silver lining of this, and it was a horrible thing, The only silver lining was that a lot of these people got exposed, and because it was interjected into normal people's lives that suddenly this was a thing, right? And it's so the kind of horrible, sloppy processes in research design that are just that I spend all my time talking about and thinking about. This was made real to people during COVID.
I agree. So, what have been your efforts to kind of combat this, and where do you see the places and fora where people can talk about this? It's, you preface, I'm not a physician. Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Not a biologist.
I'm not a biologist. I'm not a doctor. I can't say how many sexes there are. I'm not, a gym teacher. I don't know who should be in my locker room. I'm not. I think that's fallacious. I think that, I am a doctor, and I have proof, like right there. See that?
Having the letters after your name helps.
Yes, it's absolutely. I mean, some people say it just stands for mentally deficient, but I don't know. It could be both. Anyway, I think that part of civilization is civics, and if you can't, be part of it, then you deserve the civilization that you get. It's like I think that, the public health is not just a health issue; it's a political issue. The root words of public and politics are the same as the people, and if you're not involved in this, then you will, if you're not either, what is it? Lead, follow, or get out of the way, but you're going to be pushed along one way or another.
If you're not at the table, you will be on the menu. So look, for a long time, I worked for the House of Representatives for this House Subcommittee on Science, right? That was my job. And like, I can assure you, however bad you think it is, it's about 20 times worse. And people will be like, oh, it's so no, like take every single crazy horror story you've ever heard about the DMV and multiply it by 20. Because the people in charge of like the NSF, the NIH, and the CDC are being effectively led by 24-year-olds with green hair who have no idea what they're talking about anything. And literally all they know is their ideology. That's the limit of their knowledge base. Most of these people would be confused by calculus. They could not explain what calculus is to you, which is really bad when you're running everything. And what's crazy is somehow these are the people who are saying, trust the science, trust us. And like, none of you have a PhD. Like, look, I have the 3 letters after my name, which are way less impressive than yours, by the way. And I shouldn't be doing that. It's why I was more scientifically literate than all these guys. They have no idea what they're talking about. And most science journalism is being written by 25-year-old English majors because they work cheap.
Yeah. And
you can hire them really, really easily.
Yeah.
So they don't have the basics to understand, to do anything beyond reprint a press release. And as long as it aligns with their ideological preconceptions, they're just going to approve of it. They know nothing about their ideology.
Yeah, I think we've seen that kind of the layering or the suppression all through Facebook and X and whatnot. I wouldn't care about those things, if we had other, fora. But that is kind of the marketplace of ideas, and there's a control over it. I wrote an article a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, called Chat CCP, which is about Chat GPT, but not so much the inner workings of the LLM, which I think is admirable, interesting, fascinating, but like the outer layer. Most of the oranges you buy are not actually orange. They're not the color orange. They're green, and they put a kind of a ethylene bath and whatever, they turn orange. And so that well, that's great because you identify orange as orange. But a lot of the models have this kind of political external layer. They have like a, instead of saran wrap, they have like Stalin wrap over it. And
like you're saying, it's all tribal.
Yeah, and certain things you can't see. I was just like banging my head as I was, kind of looking for facts about Fauci and whatnot, writing these articles for Brownstone at the time, and you just couldn't. It wouldn't let you look at things. It wouldn't. It'd be like, no, don't. That was a wet market. That wasn't the. That was this. Just as if I
And you don't have to be like an epidemiologist to know that the one Chinese biolab facility that studies bat coronaviruses might have something to do with the bat coronavirus.
Yeah,
that is not a hard leap.
Right. It's like I don't have a pony in any of these races. I don't know for a fact. I wasn't there. I didn't witness it with my own eyes. And even these days, when I do witness something with my own eyes, you don't really even know anyway. But the fact that you couldn't consider these things, that was the problem I had.
Yes.
As a physician, all through the years, I've had sort of.
And that's anti-science. That's the thing. Not being able to even talk about it, that's the exact opposite of science.
Absolutely. And it's all a conversation and debate. And a lot of the great things that we have, I personally think that possibly the most revolutionary medicine over the last 60 years, you could include HIV drugs, fine, but without a response, the spontaneous, I think the most interesting spontaneous medication was Viagra.
Okay.
I actually, have a theory that you wouldn't have had World War II if there'd been a Viagra 100 years earlier. Okay. If Hitler were not sexually frustrated or whatever, God knows, whatever. But the thing is, that came about totally because it's off-label use. It was there as a heart medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that doctors have been, the stuff for hair now, Rogaine and Propitious, that stuff, that's all secondary use. Mm-hmm. The fact that there were some medications out there for treatment for COVID early on, and you could try them, the fact that we were forbade, whatever, from using them, that is like pathognomonic of anti-science. When people are trying to steer you, and usually those kind of corralling happen at the abattoir, if you're cattle.
And they're doing it for allegedly your own benefit.
Yeah.
And what's crazy to me about this is, look, okay, so you're a medical doctor. If your research was funded by, Philip Morris or some big tobacco company, you would be required by most ethical journals to literally say this research was paid for by whatever, right? You're not required to do that with the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, or any of those organizations. So it's literally bought and paid for, and we're not even allowed to know that the government is paying for it. Mm-hmm. And government is like a funder, just like corporations. Of course, people aren't going to criticize their paymaster. Yeah. They'd be crazy to do it. So then, and also there's the ideological angle too, right? So like you're not going to criticize your paymaster, and you're not going to criticize anything that's going to, hurt you down the line. Like Nature, the gold standard, Nature and Scientific American, they're the gold standard of research, allegedly. And they literally have editorial positions of not publishing things which, goes against it. They literally are endorsing candidates in U.S. elections. Yeah, they're saying, we need this person, not that person. If you read their justification, like a lot of it's crazy. So like, look, like their justification, I went back and I read it for the 2024 election for Kamala Harris was, she's the pro-vaccine candidate. What? Trump did the vaccine, and this video of Harris saying on video that like she doesn't trust the vaccine. So even if you are like anti-vaccine, this video of her saying the exact opposite, like this is crazy. It's tribal. It's entirely tribal, and it's entirely made up. And you're just basically being told to shut up and go away and, just listen to what your betters say. And all your betters, by the way, are working for EcoHealth Alliance in China.
Right.
Which I suspect might not have our best interest in mind.
No, it's funny. I think people understood this better when there were actual kings and queens, and they claimed divine right, and you believed that. So if they were the living embodiment of God, it was appropriate, say, and probably good for your health to bend knee and bow. And if you were obsequious enough and unctuous, you would get some, commission into the army or whatever, and you would get fed. Your family would get fed in the favor of the Duke, Duchess, Earl, Countess, et al. It's not shocking that kind of that's the system you wind up with, even though you start with, let's say, a constitutional republic. It seems to be a little bit of the default position of our, tribal grouping. Get a bunch of walruses. There's going to be some walrus, and he may be right or might be wrong, but he's the one everyone's, essentially going to be listening to one way or another. He managed to beat up the other guys. They respect him. He gets his harem of gals, and he says they go on this next track. They do. So I think it's somewhat built into the DNA, as it were. But I think we aspire better.
It's actually worse than what you're saying, in my opinion. So, like, imagine theoretically that there was a Pfizer laboratory, right? And their mission statement is that Pfizer drugs have no side effects, and everyone in their staff who went into pharmacology, they specifically did so because to crusade against the evil of believing that Pfizer drugs have side effects. Would you, as a medical doctor, accept that study if that was literally their mission statement? Probably not, right? And we know this for a fact, that a lot of research, like including medical research, especially medical research by drug companies, turns up the wrong answer simply through the file drawer effect. Like the big studies that are exciting and like, oh, this is going to cure cancer. The results that everyone wants to hear, they get published, and the rest of the ones that the negative doesn't, because nobody wants to hear that, right? Yeah. And you can, with modern statistics and even like a vague understanding of modern statistics, basically for most social science and increasingly for harder sciences, something called the confidence interval, which basically means something is 95% likely to be true, right? So if you run the same experiment 20 times, you're going to have it true once, right? Just by math. That's just how the math works. That's rolling the dice enough, you're going to get a thing. So what they do is they roll the dice until they get the result, and they publish that. And sometimes not even that's enough. There was a really great story in the New York Times, I know, like incredible, right? In which there was I think it was the trans one, right? And they had spent some ridiculous amount of money trying to prove that this reduced the suicide rate, and they couldn't get the numbers to say that. Mm-hmm. And then they didn't publish the numbers. And it's like, guys, this is not science. That's like that's politics.
Yeah.
You just don't want to believe what you say, Yeah,
not only that, but in kind of science in a way, or especially the softer sciences. I have some issue, political science, social science, use of the word, but fine. Science can mean knowledge, and science can be the scientific process. It's kind of a dual function word. But in baseball, apparently, in order to guarantee that you have the stronger, let's say you had a way to figure out the stronger team, aside from winning the World Series, but apparently it's like, in order to guarantee with an confidence interval of like 99% that you've got the stronger team to win that series, as opposed to just flukes and weather and, somebody, getting distracted or having been drinking too much the night before or whatever, an earthquake in the middle of the series, who knows? You'd have to have best out of 63. Like the World Series is best out of 7 games. And every now and then, some pitcher gets hot, some hitter who never hits, some guy who always catches the ball doesn't, vice versa. In order to do that, you have to run it 63, to have a best of 63 series. And you will, almost definitely get the best team winning that series. But nobody's going to stick around for that. That's pretty boring and repetitive. And it's dull. So a lot of times you don't get full studies. I think there are so many things that are out there that are based on fractious or inconclusive studies. One of my favorites, not favorite, but my infamous favorite is ADHD or ADD or hyperactivity. Mm-hmm. My understanding, and I have to go back and I guess do a deeper dive in this, but that the original study was like anecdotal. It was one psychiatrist looking at like 8 or 12 kids and gave them stuff and whatnot. They were off to the races. And some of the people involved in that, years later, they wrote in the New York Times that this was like the Ritalin effect, whatever. This is a little bit overdone, and we should kind of pump the brakes on it. But that shows no sign of stopping. I kind of think at the base of that is an absurdity. Cocaine and amphetamines are pretty much the same thing. Caffeine, whatnot. All these stimulants, they have tachyphylaxis, which means you get used to them. You get a little bit, and then you need more. That's why we have crack addicts doing the stuff, keep running more. So we're giving this exact same stuff to kids. Now, obviously, it's going to have an effect when they're virgin to it, naive to that medication. They're going to get, whatever buzz it is, and they're going to, sit down, maybe work a little bit more. And then after that, when you take it away, they're going to have an effect because you're not giving it to them. So it has this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of eternal treatment, which I think is, I don't know, is it a feature? Is it a bug? What it winds up doing, which is the same as what you're talking about with kind of climate stuff, is that it winds up getting people controlled. And I think
Yes.
that if you have the Turing machine, not an airplane to go to Aruba, but the Alan Turing machine, could you figure out if a robot was giving you this same answer when every single thing you promise, promote to it or propose to it, it winds up with, I'm going to control you more, I'm going to tax you more, you stop doing things, and I'm going to be in power. It seems
like as I say. Do as I say.
Yeah, it just seems like that's the answer to everything. And I think the transing our kids falls into that similar category. I think medicalizing narcotics falls into that category. Everything winds up being that you've medicalized yourself. You've taken away, literally you've given up your gonads. It's like, I'm pretty shy about that kind of thing. And people are doing that on the promise that they're going to get cared for and treated for the rest of their life. They give up their agency about possibly getting sober to take methadone or Suboxone forever, or good chunks of their life. Now they're willing to give up this dating and mating and having fun so that they can wear a mask for not forever, but for indefinite periods of time. It just seems like the answer is always, we control you, shut up.
Correct. And what's crazy to me is like they're not even doing this stuff that makes it science. That part is entirely forgotten. Like, so the authority comes from it's like this divine right of the college degree. And look, my undergrad school was the second college founded in the United States. You should not trust me just because I went to a fancy school. You should trust me because my College William Mary.
Nice.
Second, 1693.
I'm impressed.
Very old. But do not trust me because I went to a nice school. That's not a good reason to do it. But if you talk to these people, they're like, well, he went to Brown. Oh, Brown. And that's not a good reason to trust someone, because they, did well on a SAT test and probably had some nice extracurriculars 30 years ago. That's not a good reason. Look, you have to judge things, but a system by its results.
No, absolutely. It's got to be done continually, because I went to a nice school too. I don't know which ones, when it showed up on the chronology, but I went to Yale, and a little bit like you don't trust the kind of the Chinese horoscope. Everybody born one particular Chinese year is a rabbit. Everybody born some other year is a goat. Everyone, I don't know. Everyone born some other year is a rat, whatever. Or conversely, the kind of horoscope one, which is everybody born in January or some piece of January is a Capricorn. They're all alike. Nobody buys into that. That somehow everybody in your cohort of being in that school is going to be right forever. I mean, I didn't agree with everybody back then. I didn't have kind of the opinions I have now either. Probably wouldn't associate with me. They don't associate with me now.
And and yet doing your own research, that's considered to be this evil watchword. Don't do your own research, you'll die. And it's
leave it to the experts.
Actually, I think I'm generally more knowledgeable than most experts. I certainly am more knowledgeable than me. And it's look, I don't have a medical degree. I'm not going to give someone else medical advice, but I am an expert on my own body, and I know where it hurts, and you have to work together.
You're in charge of your own family. And that's, I think the inversion of the political system, I think the real political unit is the family.
Yes.
And almost everything that's been going along, is not just medicalizing things, controlling things, but it's kind of inverting and atomizing the units that keep people together with their own ideas. And so the family's been primary there.
Yeah. But again, what always amazes me about this, I was discussing this on Twitter, which is not good for my health, but the other day, so much of this thing is blinding in any trial is incredibly important, right? This is not allowing people to know what they're testing, right? Because there's a really famous story in the history of science called the N-ray. It's the opposite of an X-ray, right? And this very eminent French physicist claimed to have discovered the N-ray, and they had all sorts of great properties. And dozens of other, the great and good scientists confirmed that its existence. And then they were all nodding along quite happily. And then an American scientist stole the prism by which the NA was allegedly being projected, and they all saw the exact same result because they wanted to see it. Right? It's a great story. I highly recommend everyone reading into it. But like, look, in practice, government funding makes the exact same mistake. You are only looking where you want to find a result, right? It's like, it's the streetlight effect, which is like, the drunken search principle. If I'm going to look under the streetlight because for my car keys, if I'm drunk, because, well, that's where it's easiest to look. There's an ideological version of that where it's the most ideologically easy place to look, and that's where they look first. So suddenly we get tons of evidence that, like, of whatever, progressive shibboleth of the day is. Mm-hmm. It's really quite sad.
Yeah, no, it's a funny thing. Insofar as you could do experiments on this stuff, they were done during COVID. They were done country by country, in a sense, and sometimes state by state. I mean, the Dakotas, had some different rules about lockdowns at a certain point, but they had almost the same population, the same size, the same regulations, same geography, same weather, all kind of stuff, same politics. And one closed the school down for like a given semester, in 2021 or whatever, and the other didn't. And, did they do better? Did they do differently? It was all easy to and if you had, scientists who wanted to look at these things, they would have pointed it out. They didn't. I mean, I think that, the real sins are in omission. I guess what you call the file drawer effect. Yeah. The joke about the guy in human, HR, he's hiring people. And back in the day, to get faxes or letters, whatever. And he's sitting at his desk and he takes the whole pile of applications. He shreds half of them. And it's like, what are you doing? He says, well, I don't want anyone unlucky working for me.
Yeah. And like, back to COVID, like, I haven't done this experiment, but I guarantee if you went and you looked at like the coverage of Florida's COVID policy versus the coverage of Illinois or New York's one, Florida's was vastly criticized.
Oh, absolutely.
For a variety of things. And you had I work in GIS stuff a lot. That's imaging, right? Or like map making. And what's crazy is that the media was promoting this like literal felon data scientist named Rebecca Jones, who was like, one, a felon, two, incredibly sketchy, and three, very clearly lying. Like, it was obvious to me that she was lying. And she was being promoted as the expert because her view aligned with theirs. And at the time, people thought that the governor of Florida might be the next Republican nominee. So it was advantageous of them to attack him now.
Yeah.
Which it just shows that, like, this is all nonsense.
I mean, it was craziness. Again, speaking of those not just the Dakotas, obviously, but, I started doing these, kind of fireside chats on Facebook during coronavirus lockdowns and whatnot, because my friends asked me to, and they wanted to hear, my minimal authority on the topic. But, all the data were there. It's like New York and Florida, I think populations were comparable.
Roughly.
Genetically, race mix, the weather's a little different, so forth. But Florida skewed elderly, obviously, because it's God's waiting room. And they were doing better. They were doing better across all parameters than New York. Now, what was that?
It's just the partisanship, because that's the only index that actually matters.
Yeah, and then which one was covered, in the press and whatnot. So yeah, these are all fascinating things. My thing, was the Zika virus I told you about, and the mystery for me that seemed to have escaped Donald McNeil, who was the guy who literally wrote the book. He was one of the chief science writers in the New York Times, and he was close friends with Tom Frieden, who was the head of the CDC at the time. And pretty much, he wrote in his book, like, gleefully, like, I was the guy who made this into a panic. I was the guy who made this into a pandemic. He's like so proud of it because it's something he had to do. He saw it as something, saving the world and whatnot, but aligned with his preconceptions that, climate stuff is happening and these tropical illnesses are filtering up. And so to he needed to, like, get, the clarion call, sound the alarm that this was
being a lawyer, not being a scientist.
Yeah. So there was
taking on your client idea and saying, let's go find evidence to suit those facts.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing thing. But the funny thing for me was, I presented him my stuff. He's like, kind of like throw names at me. But, insofar as if you believe that Zika caused microcephaly, which I don't, I didn't care at the time, but when I started looking into it, I've concluded that Zika is real, microcephaly is real, but they have nothing to do with each other. But the rate, if you had an infection, if they can monitor and track the infection, the rate at which you had a microcephaly from a given naive pregnancy in Brazil versus Colombia or Venezuela was like 50 times higher in Brazil. Now, the virus doesn't speak languages, doesn't know borders. The mosquitoes don't, and the embryos don't. So how is it that you get a totally different thing? Anyway, it turns out when everything kind of got shaken out, there was no difference in rate, but there was no elevated rate anywhere. But they don't retract, they don't reformulate, they don't reconceive of anything, and it's just kind of a weird cabal. Because again, it's not the biggest industry.
That would undermine their authority.
Yeah. So I had, because you were talking about the journals and whatnot, I had my not quite 1 minute of fame. I tried to get this published during 2019 before there was a COVID thing, and I put my stuff out to the New York Times and Scientific American, everybody. I had kind of a short article, like 1,000 words or whatnot, but I thought it was right to the point, and I worked hard honing it down to just that 1,000-word, kind of like scalpel. And
I'm horrible at that, by the way.
What?
I tend to prattle, as you know. I've seen.
Oh no, I mean, obviously I talk too much, but I had this thing ready, and eventually JAMA called me, and by the time they got in touch with me, it was early 2020, and I was on a Zoom call with doctors Bauschner and Livingston, who wound up doing woke Sabuku later for other reasons. But at the time, Livingston said, "Yeah, I really like your thoughts. It's interesting. I have no way of knowing it's true, but I think it's important to publish it. But there's this COVID thing coming. He said this coronavirus thing. We don't know what that is, and this would be a bad time for you to publish that. Like, well, this has nothing to do with coronavirus. This is a mosquito-borne thing, and whatnot." And he says, "Well, yes, but it might sow doubt in the public health establishment at a crucial time." Like,
oh no.
There's every time is a good time to sow doubt in everything.
Yeah,
that is frankly your whole reason for being there.
Yeah.
Is to
people only trust scientists because scientists were supposed to admit when they were wrong.
Right.
Like the most core part of science, and why science is so hard that most people can't do it, is it involves admitting that you're wrong, and that you're wrong the first 99 times, and then you might be right the 100th. And that's really difficult to do. And the instinct to not torture the data till it confesses to your preconception is difficult. And I've seen it like a zillion times. So, like, for example, what I was talking about earlier with, I once made one of my proudest moments in academia was I forced the Washington Post to retract something. I was very proud of myself. And they were complaining about CO2, and they had this giant graphic of smog going up. CO2 is a colorless and odorless gas, guys.
Yeah, and plus it makes every plant. It makes all your food.
And it's like, this is so ridiculous. You guys, they everything is skewed to fit this narrative.
Yeah.
And if you question the narrative, you will be booted. Yeah. And you will be booted out of the Cool Kids Club. And what's interesting to me right now is we finally reached the point where so many people have been Mean Girls style booted out of the Cool Kids Club that they're starting to be a significant force. During the last election, for example, right afterwards, they were saying, "Oh, who's the left-wing version of Joe Rogan?" Joe Rogan was. You kicked him out. Who's the left-wing version of Elon Musk? Elon Musk was. You kicked him out. Same with RFK, same with Tulsi Gabbard. These people were all in the Cool Kids Club. She was the vice chair of the Democratic Party. And then they kicked him out. And
Tulsi was running for president. I mean,
yeah. As a Democrat. Yeah. And it's like,
what's to be a Democrat president, frankly. So, yeah. I still think he's a Democrat.
And what's crazy here is we're finally hit at the point. So where censorship of that style doesn't work anymore. Because the big threat used to be, we'll kick you out of our little, Cool Kids Club, like, teenage girls would. And the answer to that seems to have been, yeah, okay, do it. Like, I was kicked out of the Cool Kids Club.
You're not a cool kid?
Not according to them. But yeah, I was I got involved in science. I was all set up to do fun space things. We were going to fly a rocket plane on Mars, right? How cool is that, right? I was so excited. I had my whole life planned and set up, and then former President Barack Obama cut that program to build more climate satellites. We had, 21 agencies that do environmental science, one agency that did space exploration, and they came for the last space exploration agency, and I was out of the Cool Kids Club. And then I, of course, went to Congress, and we tried to fix that. But yeah, it's really, really bad because the shunning is a very real punishment. There's a reason that most civilizations in history did that.
Right. Yeah, you wouldn't eat, frankly. If you were shunned from your group and expelled from your town, doesn't mean you could go to the next town and eat there.
No, exile was a very real punishment.
Yeah.
And I mean, with an MD, like, it's even more real. Like, what if they come after my license?
Yeah, they went after mine. I mean, I lost my medical license in 2014. I'm not saying I was doing the Lord's work, but I always took every case as the most important case because it was that person in front of me.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are simple, like colds and sore throats and whatnot. Not a lot of thinking, but the ones that required thought, I would spend time and think about. And every patient saw me, no mid-level, whatever. I wasn't the best thing ever, but I worked hard at my job. And over time, I started taking on narcotic addicts, kind of in a secondary part of my practice, wound up being almost co-equal with my other practice. And I was doing a tapering to sobriety with narcotics, using Suboxone to get people off of all drugs, not to replace them with other drugs. We don't replace cocaine with cocaine. We don't replace alcohol. We somehow always replace narcotics because we write narcotic replacements, I think, in part. And anyway, so, I lost my license over the fact that I didn't see narcotic addiction as a disease. I think it's a bad thing. I think it's a trauma. I think people get sick with it. It's no doubt it has a physical component. But when I was suspended, the first 3 allegations were I didn't see narcotic addiction narcotic usage as a disease. And I think that
you weren't in the Cool Kids Club.
Well, yeah, it's a medical free speech thing, but they can, people ask, why does a dog, lick his private parts? Well, because he can. They can do stuff and they get away with it because they can. Nobody's forced them to do otherwise. So, I was kind of a life out in exile for a little bit. I have my license back. All the charges disappeared, and I tried to get them up to the Supreme Court, but they didn't. It was docketed, but did not chosen this year. But it's like, there's power there. I'm at a point right now where I'm like beyond the point of giving many Fs. I try to just go for what is right and true. Yeah. And doesn't mean I'm always right, but I just like to look at basic data and do comparisons. And it just seems very little of it out there.
Yes, I completely understand. Like it's really quite something because you'll get yelled at by these people who have very clearly no idea what's going on, no idea what they're talking about, and who aren't doing the most basic, like 3rd grade level science.
So let me ask you this: I'm going to put you on the spot here. Sure. So when you lose weight, let's say you were 250 pounds and you decided to lose weight and you lost 50 pounds. Where did that 50 pounds go? Through which part of your body did it exit?
Your rear end, I assume. I don't really know. I know very little about biology.
Okay. So the thing is, you breathe it all out.
That's understand. Okay. Yeah. I understand.
Yeah. Cause it's a fireplace. When you start with a log, you can start with a 30-pound log, you put it in the fireplace, you come back two hours later. Where did the 30 pounds go?
Yeah, evaporate or burn off. Yeah,
yeah, it all burned off. So we're sitting here combusting all the time, and live and breathe is to live and breathe. And so everything part of you is carbon based, and then you burn it, and you have to breathe it out. Yeah. But I only bring that up because on the margins, there are very few people in Congress and testifying whatnot who have any conception of just the basics of how your building blocks are made. The carbon dioxide is absorbed into the plants, what fraction of the atmosphere is CO2, all that kind of stuff. It's just kind of
one of the most fun things we would do is we would regularly ask witnesses how many electrons are in the outer valence shell of a carbon atom, which is like the most basic question possible in chemistry.
Yeah.
It's 4. Like, and if you didn't know that, like it's that I forget the band, but there was some famous band that like they had a no purple M&M rule, right? And it was actually designed to, make sure that people actually read the contract.
Yes, I remember that one. Yeah.
And so we would always ask these like really, like weird off the wall science questions that were very basic. And the point was that every single time the other side was asked this question or questions like this, they would always fail because they had no idea what they were talking about.
I know people don't prep that much.
But it's like a prep thing. Like, look, there is stuff that you have to know stuff,
Yeah.
Like if you need to be able to, if we're going to have a conversation about atomic theory, you need to understand what an atom is, There's it's like there's a certain base level of knowledge that you have to assume. And because most of these people who are in the Cool Kids Club, because they never question anyone, they don't have that knowledge.
Yeah, I think there's the pretty girl effect. My mom, from what I gather, what I was told by her contemporaries, was a beautiful young lady, right? And she was beautiful to me always because she's my mom and all that kind of stuff. But I think she had what I started to call pretty woman syndrome, not the movie. This preceded the movie, but I think she got along a good fraction of her time by being beautiful, and what she said, guys would just agree with. Yes, and she didn't have to like formulate concrete, kind of actionable thoughts till much later when she, frankly, was widowed, and then she had to put her concepts into practice, and they weren't always like functional. I was an adult at that point, and I wound up supporting her and giving her money and whatnot to do stuff. But a lot of times it would just like go to like the wrong places. And it's like she had no real kind of drawback on filter about what she said or did was right. And again, I think I call it beautiful woman syndrome because I think over time, she got this concept where everyone was kind of fawning over her for other reasons.
Let's call it beautiful idea syndrome, right? So when people have this beautiful idea, they have the exact same effect going on, where no one ever questions the beautiful idea, because to question the beautiful idea means that you're a bad person, and they're going to kick you out of the Cool Kids Club. And like, do you think the average sociologist selects a study design most likely to turn up evidence that like of a Republican belief being correct? Or do you think they select the study design to prove the opposite?
Yeah.
Like, And if it's 80%, like, I think it's above 90 now, sociologists are Democrats. Like, when you get large groups of people together, they form this like kind of self-organizing immune system to reject new ideas that aren't consensus.
There's a whole kind of regulatory capture cycle to it.
Yeah.
We're rounding out the hour. I just want to correct you on the 90% thing. 90% are Democrats and the other 10% are anarcho-communists.
Awesome.
Anyway, I appreciate your being here. Any conclusory thoughts for us, or ways that people can follow you, or do you want to?
So I'm on Twitter. So go ahead.
Where and how people can follow you, if in fact you want to be followed.
Oh, I'm always happy to be followed. I'm on Twitter as Andrew C. Follett. I tweet probably too much. I'm very vocal there. You can also, that will link you to various other platforms I'm on, other places. I tweet a lot. Largely about science, some about politics and other things, but I think that's the best place because it's such an open forum, right? And it's very hard tactically to censor it these days unless you're talking about like certain really specific things. So I think that's the best forum to follow me on.
So I'm in Boston in 2013. There was the marathon bombing.
Yes.
I don't know if there was X or Twitter back then, but basically the police worked at this case, blah, blah, blah. But 4chan, which is kind of a proto X form or whatever, came up with the foundation to get these guys. And there's kind of a lot of wisdom out there. And that's actually, it's science in the sense it's forensic science, if you will, or legal science. But the answers get carved out through multiple different perspectives and facets. So I like people to keep that in mind. So I very much appreciate
because people will challenge them. That's the thing. Exactly. Science inherently comes from being challenged, from having your core assumptions challenged and being forced to defend it. Whereas, so no one's pro Boston bomber, obviously. But if you're saying like, okay, here's why I think this guy's there, someone's going to call you an idiot on 4chan and say, actually, this is why he's here. And because of that, it leads to a better result. Like, this is why our court system is nominally supposed to be adversarial by nature, right? Like, my lawyer says, if you and I are in a lawsuit, my lawyer says my view, your lawyer says your view, we fight it out, and hopefully truth prevails. But that's how science is supposed to work, and that's not how it works today. Actually, Ike Eisenhower, who knew a thing or two about science and knew a thing or two about management. Everyone's heard of the whole military-industrial complex speech. If you go to that exact same speech and scroll down a little bit, he specifically says that he's most worried about science itself being held hostage to an elite. I highly recommend everyone goes and reads that speech because it's actually very interesting. And we absolutely are at that point.
Well, thank you. We'll form a club of two. Maybe we'll meet each other in solitary confinement someday. Thank you so much.
Well, they can't get me. They've tried. But
all right. Well, thank you. Have a great day.
Okay. Thank you.